So much for the opportunity, Tommy. I appreciate you. All right, so February 24th, 2022 was the first day of Russia's war in Ukraine, which started 9 years earlier and had already been waging for centuries. All of the sudden, evangelicals here in the West were supposed to take a stance on political issues, even though the Russian animosity against the West is a rather difficult thing to understand, especially when so much news is coming from very suspicious sources, not only here in the West, but around the world. As Tommy mentioned, my family and I, we typically live in Kiev, Ukraine, but we've been somewhat cut adrift due to the current genocide that's waging in Ukraine. I am deeply thankful to the dispensationalist community. So many of you have offered my family and myself so much love and support during this difficult time, and I appreciate it. As I've been bouncing around America, I noticed that a lot of Christians are asking a lot of questions about politics, which really boil down to questions about worldview. So I've been working on a PhD in applied apologetics at Liberty University, specifically on this topic, refuting the worldview of Russism, which is what we call the worldview of Russian political theory right now. And I'm building a model based off of some of the older divine institution models that you may have heard of in dispensational circles in order to use that for grounds of political discernment, with Russism as kind of the target. So in this talk, we're going to divide it basically into two parts. First, we're going to discuss what Russism is, and then we're going to talk about what Christianity says. Now, Russism is a term that has emerged primarily in Ukrainian literature. We see it some in English language literature. It comes from a merging of two words, Russia and fascism. Russism is a Russian form of a new fascism that justifies the current genocide in Ukraine. Russism also happens to be an ideology that we are seeing infiltrate certain groups of otherwise conservative Christians here in the West. Now, the Bible describes God's design for society in many ways, and one way that the Bible describes God's design is in terms of units of society that we're all a part of by default, hence the title Divine Default. These three units that are default units that we'll be discussing are the individual, the family, and the country. If we look at what the Bible says about the individual, the family, and the country, we will be able to discern a lot of problems in Russism and other errant political theories. Okay, so let's move forward and talk first about Russism and to understand what it is that we're dealing with. Now, there's a lot of appeal to Russism here in the West as we see problems in the West. Certain statements coming out of Russist leaders might be attractive at first. For example, here's a statement by Patriarch Kirill, who is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. He says about the special military operation, which is what Russians are calling the war in Ukraine. He says that it is a holy war in which Russia and its people fulfill their mission as the restrainer, protecting the world from the onslaught of globalism and the victory of the which is falling into Satanism. So we'll talk a little bit about this term restrainer in a bit, but I think one of the reasons that this is appealing is because it presents itself as a holy war, and he's holding a cross in his hand for crying out loud, so he must be a Christian, right? However, I would suggest that Christianity is a religion that as its core tenet has this notion that we are sinful and spiritually dead by default, and that we must believe in Christ for eternal life in order to return eternal life. We cannot earn our own salvation, so Christ died for us. Is that a notion that the Russian Orthodox Church would proclaim? The answer to that is no. So this is a statement about holy war that was made on March 24th, 2027, 2024. Here's a statement that Patriarch Kirill made a few years earlier. He says that if someone dies in the line of military duty in the war in Ukraine against the West, then according to the Russian Orthodox Church, we believe that this sacrifice washes away all the sins that the person commits. Now, does Christianity teach that you can wash away your own sins by dying in the war against the West, or does Christianity say that only Christ's death is what can offer us eternal life? I would say that if we read the Bible, we do not see Russian Orthodoxy. We see Christ's sacrifice as the only way of salvation. Now, in 2024, yes, it was last year, Tucker Carlson, or Tucker Carlson, as he's becoming known, had an interview with this guy and Vladimir Putin and some others. He came to Russia and started having some interviews, and a lot of ideas that we had only been hearing in Russian propaganda all of a sudden infiltrated the West, and we started hearing it in otherwise conservative circles. One interview was with this guy. His name is Alexander Dugin. Now, Alexander Dugin is an interesting guy. He's actually a leading Russian ideologist, very prolific writer. He's written several volumes, and he's developed what he calls a fourth political theory, which is kind of the political theory behind a lot of Russism. Interesting tidbit about Dugin, he really hates dispensationalism. As I read a lot of his works, many of which are not available in English, nor should they be available in English or any other language, Russian included, I've found, at least in these 5 books, certain rants in which he goes off against dispensationalism. Here are the English titles as well as the page numbers. Now, granted, he doesn't really seem to understand dispensationalism very well, but to be fair to Dugin, many of our critics don't understand dispensationalism very well. He repeats the whole lie, oh, dispensationalism was invented by Darby, blah, 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 which is false, and we got a lot of good volumes coming out about that. Here's one that you can get in the foyer, recent Pre-Trib findings, if you're interested in the historical basis for dispensationalism. There's no reason to say that it was a recent invention of Darby. But this book here in the middle, Being an Empire, which came out in 2023, has his most recent and robust rant against dispensationalism. And if you look in there and flip through the footnotes, you'll see that he mentions these guys by name. Now, it's interesting. I was talking with Tommy Ice, and I think Robbie Dean and I were talking about this some, and some of these guys were actually here at the beginning of the Pre-Trib conference. Some of them spoke for several years in the beginning. I understand John Walford was one of them. Charles Ryrie's got some videos that you can still see of him speaking here at this very conference. Ryrie's had a huge impact on my life. I'm very thankful for him. Obviously, I'm studying at Liberty, so Falwell is a big name for my life. Last year, Hal Lindsey went to be with the Lord, and in this room, in the banquets, the question was asked, raise your hand if Hal Lindsey has had a positive impact on you, and so many hands went up. Some of these guys are professors, colleagues, friends, mentors, and it might be the case that maybe some of us haven't been watching the Russian political theorists very closely, but they have been watching us. And they're framing us as part of the reason that Russia and America are enemies. A large part of that, of course, being our pro-Israel stance. Alexander Dugin has been rightfully called a violent anti-Semite. One of the reasons for this is perhaps most evident in this evil book, Znaki Velikого Norda, which stands for, it's like the signs of the Great Nord, in which he proposes what he calls a Hyperborean theory. Hyperborean is a word that refers to the distant north. Now, he was very influenced in this work by a couple of authors from the 20th century. I'll back up and give you some context for that. So, whenever Heinrich Himmler was working with the whole National Socialist movement and the Holocaust and the genocide of the Jews, he needed a ideology behind him. So he started an organization to promote pseudoscientific and pseudo-historical ideas called the Anernerbe, which is German for ancestral heritage. And he needed a fake historian who would promote fake histories about the Aryans. And so he came up with this guy, Herman Beert, who is a Dutch pseudo-historian. And he invented a particular theory of history which Dugan expounds upon in the book Signs of the Great North. Here is a basic claim that he is making, that the Aryan is the race of the Nordic king priests, the race of the Nordic king priests. How does he develop this spiritualism of the Aryans? Well, his basic proposal is as follows. In the far north, the Hyperborea, as man began to evolve, the pagans in the great north developed a form of paganism with several myths involved. And this is really the basis of all culture. Eventually, the myths started to spread south. It got wrapped up into the Middle East. So a lot of Middle Eastern myths developed about that, and then it continued further. The Jews borrowed from the pagan myths of the Great North. If you're following Judaism, you're just following a revision of Nordic paganism. It's really the ancient Slavs who are the basis of all the cradle foundation of society. It's not the Jews. So it starts with the Nordic pagans with their initial myths, and then Israel myths revise the Nordic pagans' myths. And then, of course, the church replaces Israel in the church of the apostles. And then Rome eventually replaces the apostolic church. And then Constantinople replaces Rome. And then finally, Moscow, the third Rome, replaces Constantinople. Moscow is the third Rome, and there will not be a fourth. But ultimately, this is the greatest achievement of human thought because it is now Moscow returning ultimately to its pagan roots through Judaism and all these others. Now, as dispensationalists, we have frequently talked about this erroneous move, the church replacing Israel. However, whenever we talk about Rushism and Russian Orthodoxy, we need to realize that there is another replacement where the Jews themselves are a replacement of pagans. A very low view of Scripture. And in addition to the initial replacement, we have what a lot of cults do, is a replacement of church since then. If you talk to a Mormon, they would say that the church dispensation that we're following has ended and we've been replaced by the Mormon church, just as the church replaced Israel. So we see the multiple replacements and the problems therein. This is kind of a basis for a lot of the anti-Semitism we're seeing. Now, this line of thought is quite attractive in evangelicalism, especially within certain circles of post-millennialism. Post-millennialism, often they see themselves as building the kingdom here on earth, and the method for building the kingdom is typically through conquering governments and societies and instituting a law. One of the biggest difficulties that we have for postmillennialism is that because the kingdom is not actually here and because we're not actually building the kingdom, the Bible has no instructions for how to do that. So they'll often turn to just about any idea that could be proposed for building a kingdom and say, oh, that could be building the kingdom. So currently the leading postmillennialist for this line of thought seems to be a guy named J. Rogers. We just saw what Dugan says about the Bible, and what does J. Rogers say about Dugan? He says, I have no problem considering Dugan as more than just a dissident and co-belligerent against the evils of modernity. I consider him to be a Christian brother who embraces the patristic creeds, which are the standard of Christian orthodoxy. Now, there are a couple of problems with this. First of all, we see here that the driving, I guess maybe psychological factor that we're seeing with Rogers and others is a belligerence against the West. But also I wonder if maybe he's not informed of everything that Dugan has written. He turns to the creeds as the standard of orthodoxy. we see why this is a very problematic approach to the Bible. Now, I put his book cover here, first of all, because it's as hideous as the evil thoughts within the book. But also, if you look at the top symbol, you see kind of a compass with the arrows pointing out. That's sort of the official symbol of the neo-Eurasianist movement, the Russism. Kind of like the Nazis had the swastika, that's what the Russist has. I think it's interesting, he kind of puts that above the cross. He sees this as a way to build his spiritual kingdom. Well, one problem with this, other than the fact that so far what we've seen of Russism is heretical, is simply what happens to Christians whenever Russia comes to occupy a territory. These are some charts from a study that's a little bit old. This was published on April 9th, 2023, but we're seeing testimony and testimony and testimony and evidence upon evidence upon evidence that as Russia occupies areas of Ukraine, they persecute Christians. Ukrainian Orthodox Christians are receiving the greatest blow by number, simply because that seems to be the default religion. However, second place is the Ukrainian Baptist, who have a much smaller segment of society, yet they're receiving a greater persecution by percent. Same is true of other branches of Protestantism, as well as Jehovah's Witnesses, which is not proper Christianity, but they should not be damaged the way that they are. We should be able to refute them theologically, not by killing them. All right, so that's kind of what we're seeing underneath the hood. Now, I mentioned earlier, Patriarch Kirill made this interesting statement about Russia being the restrainer. Dugin sees Russia as being this new Nordic king-priest race. The word restrainer in Russian is uderzevayushi. In Greek, it's katahon. Does anybody happen to know off the top of your head where this might be coming from? 2 Thessalonians 2. Yes, in the back there, 2 Thessalonians 2. Now, there are some really interesting discussions happening about 2 Thessalonians 2. We see the term apostasy there, and we've had some really cool works coming. Andy Woods wrote this little book, Falling Away, about the apostasy, proposing that this may well be a reference to the rapture. Lee Brainerd made an interesting book on the apostasy, holding to another view, that this is about a spiritual departure in the last ages. And the most recent contribution to the debate that I'm aware of is in Pneumaticos, the Journal of Schaeffer Theological Seminary. It came out earlier this year, in which Andy brings out some new research on the matter. There's room for diversity within dispensationalism on these topics, and I love seeing polite and loving scholarly disputes from within our camp. I think this is great what we're doing. However, one thing that we are probably more unified on is that the one who restrains the Antichrist is who? The Holy Spirit, right? What Patriarch Kirill is doing here is he's replacing the work of the Holy Spirit with the work of the Russian military, if that makes sense. And it's not just the Russian military, but Russia as a whole, with the head of Russia, who is currently Vladimir Putin, being the main restrainer. And this goes back even into the pre-Soviet times. The leader of Russia is considered the restrainer in that worldview, literally taking the works of the Holy Spirit and ascribing them to a human. And then, of course, with the claim of Russia as being Nordic king priest, we're seeing a very violent form of anti-Semitism there, where Russians are now racially being the mediators between man and God in the most pure sense on earth, while still recognizing a plurality of other religions. We're seeing a Christological heresy with the ability to die for your own sins rather than Christ. So, this is not Christianity. This is Russism. Whenever we see our friends in the post-millennialist and other ilks trying to promote this as a way of building the kingdom, I think they are grossly led astray. Another important aspect of this is that it is a fourth political theory. I mentioned this briefly earlier. It's a fourth political theory in that it follows three previous theories. The three previous theories are liberalism, communism, and fascism. Now, when we speak about liberalism, people often think about leftism. There's a difference. Whenever Dugin speaks of liberalism, he's talking about classic liberalism. It's the ideas that America was founded upon. It emphasizes individual liberty. A sample text from the political theory of liberalism would be the Declaration of Independence, which says all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So we see here the presupposition that God exists, that He's designed the individual in a unique way, and that this individual is to be protected. That's liberalism, and it's the view that the Rushists are most upset about. Now, liberalism brought about great prosperity, but the prosperity was not equal, and so the next political theory is communism. Now, the main move of communism is dissolving the individual into the collective, and this happens in a couple of stages. The first is with the father of communism, Karl Marx, who speaks of religion as being the opium of the people. Now, in the communist worldview, people are not individuals, but they are collective. In classic Marxism, there are two basic groups, the rich and the poor. It's an economic theory. So the higher nobility is struggling against the monarchy, the bureaucrat against the nobility, and the bourgeois against them all. While the proletariat is already beginning to find itself struggling against the bourgeoisie. Now, one of the big problems with communism is that it has a very high rate of failure. The first great failure being the Soviet Union. Now, as the Soviet Union begins to show how problematic this economic theory of Marxism is, some folks over in Germany start saying, okay, we need to revise Marxism. So their solution is that the move to dissolve the individual into the collective is the good move. We just need more communism. That is to say, we need to make it to where it's not just binary, rich and poor, but rather we need to develop several critical groups that are being oppressed. The rich oppress the poor, but men oppress women, the able-bodied oppress the disabled, and the Jew oppresses them all. So we see this continued in the two lines of thought. They both remain materialistic, but while the classic Marxist says it's about class struggle, the Weimar Republic, the Frankfurt School, develops what we call critical theory, which sees many critical groups. And we're still seeing a lot of critical theory being spoken about today in the West, often in terms of specified critical race theory, critical gender theory, and so forth. So that's communism. It's the big move to dissolve the individual. Now, fascism comes next. As I've already mentioned, communism has a very poor rate of failure. The first attempt to revise it was that Frankfurt School. But then the fascists come up with another idea as well. Now, Giovanni Gentile is the main thinker who formulates all of this, and he's a really boring philosopher. If you want to read boring philosophy, it's terrible. That's your guy. But here are some quotes by Benito Mussolini, who is a voice of the people that managed to popularize it. By the way, Benito Mussolini had a bit of a following here in the United States. There were a lot of people that were supportive of him. He says, anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with those of the state. Notice, it's anti-individualistic. It's dissolving the individual, but now the state is the one that kind of pushes it forward. We can't expect communism to work just by going into sort of an anarchy and hoping it's natural. Whenever you allow the invisible hand to control things, you end up with capitalism. So we need state control. He goes on, the fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. All right? So you see how fascism is about controlling with the state the mechanisms of socialism. Now, whenever we talk about fascism, there seems to be a lot of confusion here in America. One confusion is that it's some kind of a distant, foreign ideology that's already dead in the past. Here's a slide from a video. I've censored the names of the folks involved here, but the title is, "The Government is the Only Thing We All Belong to." That's a statement that's made in the video. Do you see why that is a fascist statement? That's the core of fascism. We belong to the government controls it. Now, the concerning thing about this is that this is a video that was actually played at a significant party event here in the United States. I've censored it so as not to offend anybody, to prevent any preliminary judgments against this particular party. It happens to be the Democratic National Convention, though. This is a statement that was made at the convention back in 2012. So we start seeing this very clear fascist kind of statement coming out in the Obama era. But for some reason, we're treating fascism like a statement that we just kind of paint blindly any kind of conservative, without defending Trump in any way for a lot of his actions. Whenever people say that he is a fascist because of his border policy, I tend to wonder that such people might not be very familiar with fascism. Okay, now the most famous fascist, of course, is going to be Adolf Hitler. Remember what we saw with the Frankfurt School, the dividing of socialism and communism into critical groups with critical theory. So the National Socialist movement picked that up and said there are multiple critical groups. A main critical issue is race. The Aryan race is being oppressed by non-Aryans. Combine that with the Italian ideology of state control and fascism, and now you have national fascism? No, it's national socialism. They're taking the idea of nation from fascism, combining with socialism, and that's how we get the Nazi movement. All right, so that's fascism in a nutshell. Now, Russism. This is the more obscure one of the four. It's the one that's going viral in Russian language literature and is starting to emerge in otherwise conservative circles here in the United States. So one fascist philosopher is this guy, Paulo Pozzolo. He wrote his dissertation in, let's see, do I need to put this in here? Okay. All right. Is that working? Are you good? All right. Let's scratchy. I'm getting a thumbs up. That works. Sorry about that. So Paulo Pozzolo wrote his dissertation on Russism and Alexander Dugin in Italy. Now he's working at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. But whenever we read Russist literature, they often speak of fascism as having a premature disappearance in 1945. The idea being that we killed fascism too early. We never really gave it a fair shot in court. So we need to revise it and give it another shot to see how it works out so that we can continue with social progress. So the fourth political theory borrows from the previous three, but this third theory of fascism is really what it's closest to. It's really what we're borrowing the most from. Two significant contributors from the third theory, from fascism to Dugin, are these two guys, Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger. Read their Wikipedia articles if you want to know more, but Carl Schmitt's big idea was called political theology, in which he developed the concept of Grossraum, which is big space. And his idea was that we should have big spaces that are unified, hence Germany's expansion into Poland, right? To have one big space rather than several individual countries. Martin Heidegger is an interesting character. He wrote a lot in the 30s and later, and it's that period in the 1930s, it's the Nazi period writings of Heidegger that are the most influential for Dugin. And he developed a concept called Dasein, which talks about being, if you will. It's rather odd and obscure. But in Dugin's words, he describes as follows. He says, the subject of communism was class, fascism was either government in the Italian fascism of Mussolini or race in the National Socialism of Hitler, and of course in liberalism the subject was the individual. But finally, the ontological basis of the fourth political theory is Martin Heidegger. And to support this, he'd go to the Nazi-era text of Martin Heidegger, in which he speaks of the enemy being the one who possesses an essential threat to the existence of the people and its members. This is where the concept of Dasein comes from. Martin Heidegger was pushing that we need to exterminate anyone that could be a threat to the Aryans. So we combine that with the great space concept in Carl Schmitt, which is a project of future unification of big areas. And so Dugan basically says the continental thinking of the genius of Carl Schmitt allows us to outline the circle of ours and not ours, not on the basis of the countries as we have it now, but on the mainland. Then he goes on a rant here about America and England being Russia's enemies, having always been that way. So this statement about Russia being enemies with America, obviously that comes after the escalation in 2022, right? Wrong. Actually, this is a statement that Dugan made back in 2004, even before Russia invaded Georgia. The notion that somehow or another Russia has only recently become an enemy of America is entirely misguided. So whenever Dugan sees a map like this of the world as it exists today with several countries, he would say that this is bad news. Instead, we need to dissolve borders and expand into great land masses. Now, where to draw the borders is a little difficult to discern. One idea is this. It's from Karl Haushofer, which is another National Socialist. Unlike Schmitt and Heidegger, he didn't continue writing in the later years. He committed suicide in 1946 to avoid being brought to justice. And in his idea, there should be like 4 big zones. Dugan's not that extreme. He says that we should identify civilizations and try to draw the borders around a multipolar future, which only has about a dozen or so big territories rather than several individual countries. And of course, it is necessary for Russia to have an expansive program to that end. Now, the last couple of slides we just looked at are maps that I've taken from one of Alexander Dugin's textbooks, which is studied in universities across Russia. If you go to the Russian West Point, you have to study Dugan. And he's got some helpful maps there, and he's written 25 volumes on identifying where an ethnos begins or ends, and it is still non-conclusive where to draw the lines. So it is a political theory that is internally inconsistent and broken. So in summary of all of that, here is the working definition of Russism that I'm working with for my dissertation. Russism is the worldview of Russian fascism, which is characterized by a desire for a few great powers instead of many distinct countries, an emphasis on group identities over great expanses, and compatibility with the Russian Orthodox Church's interfaith mention of symphonia with the Russian state. Now, more could be said about that. But the big topic here is Christianity. What does the Bible say? Does the Bible give us any insight that we can use for looking at a political theory such as Russism, or other political theories for that matter? Can we look at leftism? Can we look at the classic liberalism that America is founded upon? Can we use the Bible to decide whether or not these are sustainable models, whether or not they're good models? I would argue, yes, we can. Now, while all that's been going on over in Russian philosophy, there's been an interesting movement happening within Western philosophy. The movement is on social ontology. Social ontology has kind of gotten the main stage in Western philosophy. We've got conferences popping up on it. We've got organizations and journals on the topic of social ontology. Brian Epstein here is a philosopher. I've got no reason to believe that he's a believer in Christ. It would be awesome if he was. Salvation is available to him like it is to everyone. But he defines social ontology as follows. Social ontology is the study of the nature of the social world. What is X? Social ontology asks, where X stands for any social thing whatsoever. So from the secular perspective, the kind of questions that they're talking about are, what is money? What are institutions? What are social groups? What is a credit card? Contracts, churches, families? What are governments? However, as biblicists, I think that we could be interacting with the current topics in philosophy from a biblical perspective. The way I would advise reframing the question is, what is God's design for society as we see it revealed in the Bible? As we explore this question, I think one way we can approach it is in terms of units in society that God has designed for all people to be a part of by default. And those three are the individual, the family, and the country. Whenever you are born, you are an individual, you are part of a family, and you are within a country. There are extreme circumstances. I'm not denying the fact that women die in childbirth sometimes, and a child can be born without parents. That's an unfortunate situation that happens. If you're born at sea, then you're a stateless pirate. Okay, maybe you don't have a country. But if you're raised this way, it's difficult. And I think it is difficult because God designed you to be a part of these three things. Okay, so let's take a look at what the Bible and Rosh Hashanah are saying about these three issues. We'll start with the individual. Now, as previously mentioned, we have the three political theories: liberalism, communism, fascism, and Russism. The first one is liberalism, and that's the one that the Rushists are the most ticked off about. It also happens that there is a great continuity we saw between communism, fascism, and Russism. We could put a bold red line right here separating liberalism from the others. And what was that big move that happened? It's the dissolving of the individual into the collective. If the Bible puts an emphasis on the individual rather than the collective, then that is a move that we can say communism and all of its derivatives are attacking the Bible. And I think there are a lot of political theories we could put in that little bunch. So here's another statement regarding the nature of man that comes from Oscar Svarte. That's the pen name of a Russist philosopher. He's a pagan philosopher. Oscar Svarte apparently is an old Norse term meaning dark ash tree or something crazy like that. Now he says, according to manifestationism, which is the worldview of paganism, the whole world is a manifestation of divinity. There is no creator or creation. The world and God are identical. They are ontologically equal, originally by nature. So whenever you look at a tree, whenever you look at another human, they are both featuring this continuity, a manifestation of divinity. Whereas creationism, that would be our worldview, emphasizes especially the fundamental non-identity of Creator God and the creation, expressed by creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing, as opposed to the manifestation of deity in paganism. So this is a involved topic. If you look at creation myths from pagan worldviews, they'll often have man being a continuation of divinity. I think we can also look at atheism, which sees a big bang, and we see the same manifestation there, such that man and nature are fundamentally equal, being one and the same. However, in Christian theology, we have the entire doctrine of anthropology within systematic theology, wherein we can read the Bible and we see statements such as this: God created man in his own image. He put him in the Garden of Eden, in the earth, to fill it, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over everything that moves on the earth. When we read the biblical depiction of the individual, we're not seeing manifestationism. We're not seeing man being equal to nature. Rather, we're seeing man being unique and above nature. Now, granted, God gives us responsibilities. He doesn't just want us to destroy the planet, right? But the basis for ethics in environmentalism is not that that tree and I are the same manifestation, but rather God put me above the planet and I need to take care of his creation. Do you see the distinction there? Okay. We also see the concept of individual responsibility for the individual. God tells Adam to tend the garden and keep it. He says not to eat of that fruit. In the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. See how the emphasis here is the individual. It's a personal responsibility rather than a collective. And then as soon as Adam and Eve sinned, of course, both thistles and thorns and thistles shall grow for you. You shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread. Work is something that God wants us to be involved in. Work is a holy thing. Granted, it's difficult now after the fall, but we can derive a meta-ethics, a reasoning for our ethics of work from the Bible itself. Whenever we look at communism and post-communist ideologies, they're frequently trying to dissolve that. They're trying to have collective property such that everyone works according to his ability and is compensated according to his need, so that it dissolves that individual responsibility with labor. Another topic within anthropology, the Christian doctrine, is ontology and the facets of man. We see in the Bible that there is a material aspect of man as well as an immaterial. We see things like in James 2:26, the body without the spirit is dead. That's because there's a material body and immaterial spirit. Now, there are some really cool conversations happening among the textbooks about is man 2 parts or 3, and we don't have to get into all of that, but there's room for disagreement and debate. But there's also kind of a middle ground of man, sort of a firmware, if you will. For example, the material consists of your tongues, your lips, your teeth, your mouth, your cheeks, your jaw, whereas you have immaterial, your mind, your will, the image of God. With these two things combined, we have a unique capacity for human language with men. And as we read the Bible tells us things about language. For example, in Genesis 1, when God is creating everything, he uses the term God said 10 times, 8 of those times before there was even a man to speak. His commands are understood literally, and if we read the Bible further, we see that intertextual citations continue to understand the Bible literally. Some things that we can derive about the nature of language just from reading the opening of Genesis, and then it remains consistent as we go. Our capacity for language is something that God designed and gave us uniquely. Language existed before man. God had it, right? He gave it to us. And then he uses human language to reveal the scriptures. What are some takeaways we can take from that? Well, we should then use the conventions of human language to interpret the Bible. That's a brief crash course on hermeneutics. If you read the Bible within the conventions of human language, rather than spiritualizing everything, you'll end up in the school of thought that we call dispensationalism. Now, a common attack that we are seeing on hermeneutics is what we just saw earlier with the pagan hermeneutics and the pagan meta-hermeneutics. Because language is something that evolved and then had its earliest, best human expression in the Nordic pagans, we should return to that. And as you read Dugan and others and you see how they approach the scriptures, it's entirely wacky. It's not at all literal, grammatical, historical hermeneutics. It is the worst possible sorts of allegory that you could imagine. Another middle ground that's currently under attack in human anthropology comes as follows. So the human is born with physical traits, formed in the womb with physical traits, and he has self-awareness. Among physical traits, we have sexual reproductive organs as well as other secondary sexual traits. And we have a self-awareness of this. And so the middle ground of that is typically spoken of as gender identity. Gender is an interesting term that has an interesting history in the English language. We can talk about that in the back room sometime. Whenever we read the Bible, we see the following. Male and female, he created them. So God has created a binary structure of male and female. So the normal response then would be for us to recognize through our self-awareness our own physical traits and have a gender identity that aligns properly. However, this is under attack today through such movements as critical gender theory. Remember what we were talking about with Frankfurt, how they are saying that there are multiple oppressed groups. One basis for the multiple oppressions, they would say, is gender identity. And so critical gender theory comes out of that, trying to dissolve you as an individual into a collective gender identification. Often these gender identifications are not cisgendered, male or female, but transgender, moving from male to female, female to male, or something even outside of the male-female design. Okay, so these are the sorts of attacks that we're seeing on the individual within political theory today. The next unit is the family. So this is an area where there's a lot of confusion about Russian ideology. A lot of people will tell me, well, maybe Russia is the good guy. They're standing for traditional family. They're standing for conservative values. Is that true? If it is true, what does it mean to have traditional values? Here is a special report that was published by the Institute for the Study of War. It's a nonpartisan think tank. And one of the reasons that Russia's actions qualify as genocide, one of the reasons why that is an appropriate term for what's being used, is that the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which is the document we see on the right, has in Article 2, point E, it defines genocide to include forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So, if you enter a country, you remove the children from the country and put it into another group to be raised by another group, that falls under the grounds of genocide because you're trying to change ethnicities of children. Okay. Whenever I use the term genocide, people frequently think about the Holocaust immediately, which is a very clear case of genocide, but that's not the only form of genocide that there is. Okay, so Russia is turning deported Ukrainian children into bargaining chips. They continue to kidnap Ukrainian children, put them in Russia. They send them to camps for brainwashing. They baptize them into Russian Orthodoxy. They try to remove the Ukrainian identity. The removal of children away from the family is a move that I think would be relevant to our discussion here. Now, while all of that is going on, we see statements like this coming out of Vladimir Putin. Traditional values are moral orientations, formulating the worldview of Russian citizens, transmitted from generation to generation, lying at the foundation of all Russian civil identity and the country's unified cultural expanse. Okay, well, that sounds like a good thing, right? We like conservative values. What are some traditional values we have? Well, family is one, right? So is the individual. Traditionally, America is a Christian nation, as they say. So returning to traditional family means to stay away from homosexual marriage, for example, right? That sounds right if we're framing it in terms of American questions. But what is the basis of marriage? What's the basis of family? Is it tradition or is it the Bible? It happens that here in America we've been greatly blessed because our traditions line up very closely to what we're seeing in the Bible. We're seeing monogamous marriage as kind of the tradition. However, we're moving away from that, and it won't be long before maybe tradition includes something else. Tradition certainly includes other things in Russia. There are several traditions represented in this picture with Putin, for example. Russia's federal law, number 125FZ, was issued in 1997, and it lists Buddhism and Islam, along with Eastern Orthodoxy, as traditional religions. Well, Buddhism has traditionally recognized homosexual marriage. Islam is a religion that was founded by a polygamous pedophile. Those traditions do not align with the biblical description of marriage. The Yarovaya law, issued in 2016, does not recognize Protestantism as a traditional religion within Russia. And so Protestantism is being suppressed because it's not tradition. Do you see why the word tradition is a very dangerous concept here? because we're not traditionalists, we are biblicists. We have to maintain the distinction. Now, as long as tradition and biblicism go hand in hand, it can get confusing, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with tradition. It's Christmas season is coming up. Some family traditions eat turkey, others eat tamales for Christmas. Personally, I'm a bigger fan of Hanukkah. But you can't celebrate Hanukkah because you're not Jewish. Well, I'm not an atheist either, but I still celebrate April Fool's Day. So tradition is not where we go to define family. We go to the Bible. Now, one of the best, clearest, concise statements about what the family is comes right here out of Genesis 2. In verse 24, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So what does that look like? We have two basic facets, the marital relationship and the parental relationship. Whenever a man joins his wife, they become one flesh. This is the beginning of a family unit. And a result of the family unit is often babies coming out. Whenever the babies are born, they're born into that family unit. And they grow up, and they remain in the family unit. Meanwhile, parallel to that, another family unit is growing, and children are growing in there. And then a man from one family, a woman from another family will become one flesh. They'll leave their mother and father, become a new family unit, and then they'll have children, and they'll be raised in that. Now, that doesn't change the fact that they're still having these parents, and we are to honor our parents for our entire lives. Jesus has some very interesting things to say about that. But the family, as many things are, is under the influence of sin today. One thing that we're seeing is an attempt to redefine marriage so that it's not one man and one woman, but rather it may be two men or two women. This does not fit the biblical description because it is not a man and a woman becoming one flesh, but two men and two women who are not able to become one flesh biblically. So the concept of a biblical marriage is not, or a homosexual marriage is not possible. A slightly more controversial issue is polygamy. If a man becomes one flesh with a woman, and then another woman comes in and becomes one flesh, what do we have? Two women now becoming one flesh with one another. Polygamy is by nature bisexuality, and it is therefore wrong. We're seeing a lot of problems as people leave Islam and come to Christianity. Well, they're still stuck with a polygamous marriage. What do you do with that? Or what if a homosexual couple becomes believers, and they want to serve Christ now? It takes some wisdom to figure out how to navigate some of these issues. A more common problem that we're seeing, not only in Russia and Ukraine, but also here in America, is the attempt to dissolve marriage. What we frequently see now is a man and a woman will live together with sexual relations before actually getting married. In fact, when my wife and I were engaged in Kiev, it was almost scandalous. What? You're actually engaged to get married and you're not living together yet? Well, how backwards are you, right? I think that's going to become the traditional marriage very soon, that you just move in before you tie the knot. This, I think, is a very dangerous arrangement because it blurs the distinction between what a married couple is and what it isn't. This is not to say that we have to stick to any particular wedding traditions. It might be with a huppah, it might be with this ceremony or that ceremony. And it's interesting, God designed marriage for all people, and generally speaking, we have monogamous marriage all over the world with various traditions, and the traditions themselves are fine so long as they're aligned with the biblical but is the wrong one. Is it alive? Working? Okay, great. Okay, so we see how marriage and family are under attack due to sin. So the first societal unit was the individual, and the second is the family. The third is the country. Now, if we'll return to Alexander Dugin, his idea is that of civilizations, or to use his word, ethnos. He would say that, Europe is starting to go into this weird 2S LGBTQIAA plus direction. I think that's currently the most robust alphabet soup. But that's fine. That's their tradition. That's the direction they want to go. In Russia, we want to have Islam, Buddhism, and Russian Orthodoxy, and we want that to be expanded. And America can have its place in the future, and African civilizations need to be broken off into their directions as well. It's not so much that they're looking at what is happening in the West and calling it evil. We who are conservative Christians are comfortable living in the West and saying that there is evil here. But for the more pluralistic ideology of Russism, it's not evil per se. Rather, it's just not appropriate for this particular civilization. So I see a lot of people getting excited about perhaps Russia speaking out against the West, but they're not doing it on biblical terms, and what they're actually pulling for is contrary to what Scripture says. Okay, so what does the Bible say about a country? I think if we look at the text, we can derive a country as a unit having these three facets. A country is a distinct territory with a civil government that exists to protect the people in the land. To get to the bottom of country, you got to understand two basic events in the Bible and their effects. The first event is the giving of the Noahic covenant, which we see in Genesis 8 and 9. And then the next is the global dispersion, which happens from the Tower of Babel in the early part of Genesis chapter 11. So the Noahic covenant has this: surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Now, if we think dispensationally, we can go back to the Garden of Eden. We typically call that the dispensation of innocence. When man is innocent and then they eat from the tree, they receive what? The knowledge of good and evil. And so presumably for the next dispensation, it's the human conscience that works as the guide. It's very much a Pinocchio land. Use your conscience. That doesn't work, as much as our post-modern friends say that it will work if we try it again. And it ends with global debauchery. So now, in this new era, we still have our conscience, which is something of a restrainer, but also man is now accountable to his fellow man. If somebody commits murder, a man is to execute that guy. Now, for this system of executions to take place, it would require a system of courts to make sure that you're doing this in a just way. And so that's your basic foundation for civil government. And there's a lot of freedom, I think, in the Bible about how to organize a civil government. I happen to think that the American Constitution does a pretty good job, especially after the amendment that we fought so hard for in the Civil War. But it's not a divine document by any means, and I appreciate that we're able to adjust it. But the Noahic covenant is the basis for civil government. Now, as we go on, God says to man that he should spread out and fill the whole earth. And man says, nope, not doing that. We're going to build ourselves a city and a tower to make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad. And God says, okie doke, I will scatter you across the face of the earth. And he happens to use confusion of language to make that work. And languages are still confused, and we still have to have translation ministries today. So, we have a scattering. Now, there's an interesting passage that comes up later in the Song of Moses. In Deuteronomy 32, we see this: remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you your elders, and they will tell you, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations. When was that? Tower of Babel, right? Very clear reference to what we're talking about. When he separated the sons of Adam, That's a repetition of the same, right? Tower of Babel when he scattered everybody. He set the boundaries of the people. So it seems that there is a reference here to, at that point when God dispersed man around the world, he set up boundaries and physical barriers. Now, what does that look like? This is where some creation research comes into the picture. So this is a chart by the Geological Society of America, which does not lean toward young Earth creationism, but it shows the geological time scale with various eras in geological history. We can divide these up, and I think they have incorrectly labeled how old these various layers are. However, whenever you look at rock layers, there are indeed layers, and they do indeed have the names, so there's nothing wrong with using the names. I might challenge the age and say that the Earth is a lot younger than it actually is, and the flood has a great contribution to that. So if we stack these up like so, we'll have a representation of the various rock layers in the world. Now, there are some really interesting conversations happening within the various circles of creation research, and I've been so blessed to get to run in these circles and hear the debates. I'm the theologian in the room, and it's fun hanging out with the geologists and the paleontologists. They're so great. I love these guys. But one of the current big debates deals with flood boundaries. Now, what we talk about when we talk about flood boundaries is the entire world was covered with water. And while that was happening, a lot of rocks and dirt was being deposited. So the question is, which rock layers were deposited before the flood, which were deposited during the flood, and which were deposited after the flood? So the question of the pre-flood boundary deals with what was before, and the post-flood boundary is that which was laid in the flood, and then everything after is a post-flood. Now, a lot of people really get uptight about this conversation. I tend to lean toward the KPG boundary for the flood, post-flood boundary, and I've got a lot of friends who hold to other opinions, and that's perfectly fine. I'm not going to put up a fight over where that occurs. Here's what we're going to do instead. Instead of going to the distinct point of where the KPG flood boundaries is, I want to demonstrate that the flood post-flood boundary is at least around here, the Oleogene, and somewhere below that. The way I think we can support this claim is by looking at the continuity of antelope fossils around America. When you look at where the antelope fossils are, both geologically in terms of what state they're in, for example, as well as where they are in the rock layers, we see that there's a continuity from the Oleogene all the way up until today. That means that either antelope came to America and started dying and being deposited at that time and continue living there until today, or alternatively, antelope lived there, got on the ark, came off the ark, and then returned to their ancestral lands. And that ain't no kind of behavior for an antelope. All right, so antelope continuity would mean that the flood post-flood boundary is somewhere below here. Now, some interesting research that's come out of creationism would be this paper by these guys. You can download the slides and look it up if you'd like. I've got it in the bibliography at the end. And they identify certain fossils as being human based on behavior. If you have a human-looking fossil in a cave with art there, that's probably something that humans are involved with. We don't see monkeys making art, for example. And if we follow the earliest human fossils, we see that they are dispersed in the Paleogene. Okay, the earliest human fossils are found, in the Pleistocene. Okay, so that's where we see antelopes. So we know that nothing above this was placed by the flood. Then we begin to see humans here in the Pleistocene. So whenever we see humans being dispersed in the Pleistocene, there's reason to believe that the Tower of Babel occurred during the Pleistocene. Does that kind of make sense? Do one of these if it kind of makes sense, one of these if it doesn't. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of these. That's a good thing. So the Pleistocene is a fancy schmancy word for the Ice Age of cartoon fame with the silly squirrel. If we look at a map of the Earth, this is a map of the Earth reconstructed for the Pleistocene. The title of the map is A Map of the Earth as it appeared approximately 21,000 years ago at the peak of the last glacial maximum during the late Pleistocene. I would argue this probably wasn't 21,000 years ago, maybe in the category of a couple thousand. But if we look at this, there's a lot of ice, and as there's more ice, that means what? There's less water in the oceans. Less water in the oceans means the water sinks, or the sea level is further down, which means there's more land. So at this time, there would have been several land bridges. For example, over here, you could walk perhaps from modern-day Cambodia to Indonesia. Okay. So if this is what the world looked like at the Tower of Babel dispersion, then men would have been able to get around. They could have walked across land bridges. They could have walked across ice bridges. And the Bible says that God set the boundaries whenever he dispersed man. So this is what the late Pleistocene looked like. And this is kind of what the world looks like now. What happened? It seems that God may have used climate changing, not the weird stuff that we're being told to freak out about now, but legitimate collapse of the Ice Age in order to place boundaries on Earth. Whenever we zoom out and look at the whole planet, we see certainly some changes at the continental level. We see islands being separated. But the end of the Ice Age would have had a whole lot of effects on land as well. As all of the ice begins to melt, that water has to go somewhere, so it empties into rivers, and the sudden influx of water will cut rivers a lot more rapidly. Here's a map of the world's free-flowing rivers. Now, if you look at a map of the world as it exists today with borders, it looks something like this. And if you look closely at the lines between the countries, several of them look squiggly, to use the technical term. The reason that they are squiggly is because we tend to use rivers and other natural boundaries to keep countries distinct from each other. This would align very well with what we see as God's design for the country in terms of physical territory. He separated the sons of Adam and set boundaries of the people because God wants us to have distinct countries rather than giant land masses of people that are brought under single capitals. Interesting tidbit about this verse, the last little line here, it seems that God separated the countries according to the number of the children of Israel. Now this is what it says in the Masoretic text, and I tend to think that the Masoretic is probably the most reliable on this particular passage. Others would say, well, there is a different reading according to the number of the angels of God in Codex Vaticanus, for example, the Greek Septuagint. We see, according to the number of the sons of God in Qumran, in 4Q Dut. So one idea is perhaps he was dividing the world according to the demonic realms. We can support the idea of demons ruling countries and stuff and having a significant influence from Daniel. And we can support Israel's influence on the nations from other passages. But here I tend to think that the reading according to the number of the sons of Israel is the better reading. For one thing, the Septuagint itself is worthy of textual criticism, and there are several Greek traditions that have, according to the number of the sons of Israel, like the Masoretic text does. In fact, Justin Martyr was in his debate with Trypho, and he actually speaks of Trypho's variant here, that it was according to the sons of Israel. There was already a dispute in place, but that predates the Masoretes by centuries, so this is by no means a Masoretic invention. What's also interesting is some of the other translations, like the Peshitta follows the Masoretic here, but also the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritan Pentateuch is a little notorious for abandoning Israel-centric passages and trying to read themselves, the Samaritans, into it. If the sons of Israel or sons of God reading was already present, it would not be typical for the Samaritans to put Israel in here when they weren't already in place. So I think there's a good reason to say that it's the sons of Israel, the Masoretic reading. And if you go Septuagint, there are some fine theologians that go that way as well. Also some bad theologians. This would align very well with what we see with God speaking to Abraham, saying, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. The way that God seems to have set up countries is so that a country should have physical barriers around it so that the country can protect itself. Countries aren't meant to be expansive and invading other countries. They're meant to preserve their own. However, the good news about the God of Israel should still be able to get out because these barriers are still able to be traversed and crossed in order to get the word out. Of course, the church is on a mission now of making disciples of all the nations and a mission of evangelism. So we're not saying that people should be absolutely secluded. Rather, it simply seems that God's design for the country is that it's a distinct territory with a civil government to protect people in the land. This is contrary to what we're seeing in Russism, which tries to expand borders. It's also contrary to what we see with other forms of multipolarity, like what we're seeing with the New Economic Forum and so forth, those that want to dissolve the borders. Okay. So we've taken a look at the social ontology, God's design for society in terms of the individual, the family, and the country. These are units that we're all part of by default. We've compared that to Russism, which is an idea that's starting to infiltrate otherwise conservative evangelical circles. So I think we have a good basis if we'll stick to these things to refute future challenges in social political thought. You can get the slides online. I've concluded a selected bibliography, and as a final note, I'd like to express my thanks to the scholastic, dispensationalist, and creation research communities for their insight and encouragement over the years I've been working on this, as well as to the Israel Defense Forces and Armed Forces of Ukraine for providing a safe environment in the West for me to carry out this research. Thank you.
I'm sure y'all absorbed in detail all of this information here. Questions? Go ahead. Shoot.
My name is Rob Cooper. I've been directed by Liberty University to integrate AI into my courses, and I know nothing about AI. But my question to you is regarding Dugan, with 25 volumes, is there an AI tool an English speaker can use to research his thoughts on what's going on in the world?
Is there an AI tool in place that can research Dugan's material? I don't know. If there isn't, I wouldn't be surprised if there's one that's not going to become available soon. As far as I know, some of the quotes that we've looked at in this presentation, this is the first time some of this material has been presented in the English language. I think with the direction that AI is going, it's probably going to become available soon. Some of this stuff is difficult to access. Some of them are PDFs that you can download. Some you have to pay for. I prefer to, I always hold a very high standard of ethics whenever it comes to distributing PDFs and stuff. We have a problem with piracy in Ukraine. However, whenever it comes to some of these evil ideas, I encourage people to use whatever pirate source is to keep as many kopecks out of Dugan's pocket as possible. Some of the PDFs are a bit of a pain because if you don't know one of the words in Russian, you gotta write it out and look it up. You can't just copy and paste. It's a bit of a task, but being as how a lot of this is available in PDF form, I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be something that comes out soon. I don't have access to that kind of thing. A lot of the PDFs are difficult to find. Some of the main volumes from that 25 volume theory the ones that deal with Russia specifically. The first one that deals with kind of the prolegomena for it all. Those are pretty easy to find. Some of the ones in the middle that I've dealt with regarding America and Europe and even some African cultures, those are available, but it's a real pain. So.
Thank you very much. That was a very excellent, informative presentation. What are your thoughts on the resolving the Ukraine war? Previously, there was a move to supply Ukraine with weapons they need to fight. Now they're trying to hopefully starve Russia, but with economic isolation. And then there's a negotiated settlement to the war. Should Ukraine be allowed to join NATO? What territories should they keep? What territories should they forget about? Crimea and so forth.
Those are interesting questions. I'm a scholar of ideology and biblicism. I'm not a scholar of military studies. I do have my own opinions on what military actions would be most effective, but I don't think my opinion should be valued all that much on that topic. Historically, whenever we look at the way that Putin has behaved in the past, for example, whenever he invaded Georgia in 2008, President Bush at the time sent some Navy to the Black Sea, and like a little playground bully, Putin backed down. That kind of resolved it. In 2021, not a lot of people know this, we were in Ukraine at the time, and we got a new president in America, and then Russia started to put troops on the border in the spring and kind of testing out the new waters. And then Biden sent some boats to the Black Sea, and once again, he backed down. The difference between the spring of 2021 and the fall of 2021, in my opinion, is Afghanistan, when Brandon showed his inability, militarily speaking. It emboldened Putin. And then in February of 2022, Biden withdrew the American troops that were present and told Russia that he would not strike if they were to invade the north. And then on the 24th, they did. So I think, I like what John McCain said earlier in the war before he died, before the escalation. He said, nothing provokes Putin like weakness. When I hear people talking about Biden provoking Putin, I think that's true, but he didn't provoke him by any kind of show of strength. He provoked him by showing weakness. As we see, Russia has always been America's enemy. It was an anomaly that in the 90s, Russia was too chaotic to pose any kind of threats. But they're back to their old tricks again. So I tend to think that the best way to resolve this and to expedite Ukrainian victory would be to stand up to Russia, return the American troops to Ukraine. One benefit with some of Trump's policies, right? So one of Vice President Biden's defenses for betraying our peace agreement with Ukraine, when in the Clinton era, so every time we've had a Democrat in office since the fall of the Soviet Union, it's been very bad for Ukraine, very good for Russia. In Clinton's administration, we had the Budapest Accords, in which Ukraine agreed to give up its nukes if America, UK, and Russia would protect Ukraine. Well, whenever Russia violated this peace treaty with America, Vice President Brandon said, because Ukraine is too corrupt, we will not honor the peace accords. Now, whenever I hear Republicans making the same argument, I think it's odd that they're making such extreme Democratic positions rather than Republican positions of strength. But no Ukrainian would ever say that we don't have a problem with corruption. Of course we do. We came out of the Soviet Union. If you like corruption, then Russia's the good guy, not Ukraine. Of all of America's allies, nobody has paid a higher price in the fight against corruption than Ukraine. So it's my military opinion, for what that's worth, that by standing up to Russia, it'll cause them to back down. However, with Trump's extreme positions, worse than Biden's, of trying to betray our allies, a good thing that's coming out of this is that Europe is beginning to realize that ever since 1945, we've allowed America to be the big superheroes to save us from whatever occasion. It's now starting to look like that's not going to work. So we're starting to see an escalation of military might in Europe, which is good. There are concerns of a potential attack on Europe in future years.
Would someone shut that door back there and keep it shut, please? Also, how does this fit in with your understanding of the Battle of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38:39?
Good question. So first and foremost, this is not Gog and Magog.
Right.
That's kind of a quick reaction that some that aren't too familiar with the text will go to.
But how is it setting up for?
So I think less in terms of Gog Magog, right? The expansion of Russia and its influence, assuming that Russia is Rosh, which is a point that's been contended. This could be setting up Russia to be strengthened for an attack on Israel. It's interesting. A lot of people say, well, you know, you're only saying Russia's a bad guy because of this. And it's like, well, no, we had a lot of guys talking about this during the Cold War. Oh, well, yeah, that was just the Cold War. And they say, oh, yes, but even before the Cold War, people were making the identification. And then you could probably come back and say, well, look at what it was like back then. Russia has always been the bad guy. You shouldn't read Russia into Rosh for that reason.
Well, didn't the Russians bring their fleet in during the War of 1812?
Let's see. You know the song, the 1812 Overture. That's,
Yeah, I know,
so
I know, but
I forget the particular
I
involvement with
think
that.
Russia
conflict.
helped us in the War of 1812, and the British, they brought in their fleet into Baltimore area.
This could be what part of what Dugan is speaking about when he speaks about Russia's long-term conflict with England, right? There's currently a territory that was under Russian control during the prior to the Soviet Union days. It was under the Russian Empire, and now there's currently a big push to regain the land. I'm speaking of Alaska. There are propaganda pieces saying we should retake Alaska. A lot of people don't realize this, but Russia has had pieces of America and they want it back. Well, there are also parts of the Pacific Northwest in Washington that belong to England for a while that's currently American. So there's a lot of history going back that far. My tendency with that would be to say we shouldn't read the current events into the Bible, but rather read the Bible into current events. We can discern from the Bible that Satan knows the Bible, presumably. He knows that this is coming, but he's not omniscient. He doesn't know when the timing of the future is. So instead of trying to say, well, Russia's the bad guy, so it must be Rosh, I might be inclined to say, well, Satan knows that he needs to have a strong Rosh. So all of these times, every time we see Russia doing all this in 1812, when we see their activity in the Cold War, when we see it now, whenever Russia keeps trying to expand, it could be that Satan is trying to prepare a Gogish figure for this coming up war. Another thing that we might compare it to is a future treaty with the 10 nations. Whenever we see multipolarity being pushed, not only by Russia, it's the same keyword in the left. We're not seeing globalism anymore. If you go to the World Economic Forum website, go to the search bar, type in globalism, you'll see that all your hits are from like 2020 and earlier. Type in multipolarity, you'll see new hits all the way up to today. It could be that the world is moving toward a multipolar situation, and that could be something that Satan wants to use for prophecy as well, if the Lord doesn't tarry, but he well could. Satan doesn't know that, so he's kind of got to keep things on board.
Go ahead.
I believe Gog is a demonic entity, not a person. But anyway, you know, in Dugan's model, they had 4 regions of the world. And,
That would be Haushofer's, who really influenced Dugan. Haushofer was a...
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But the point is you remember the map that had the arrows pointing down and towards mostly Europe and Asia and stuff. But then there was one arrow that went all the way over to Cuba. That looks kind of weird. I was wondering if you could explain the thinking behind that.
So this is borrowing from a couple of earlier geopolitical thinkers, actually some British influence on this particular one. The idea is that there is a heartland and a rimland, if you will. They would say that the heartland is basically where the Russian Empire was. The rim land kind of extends through Central Asia. There's a lot of Russian-speaking countries there, and into Eastern Europe. And then everything else is kind of in a big struggle with Russia over the rim land. So they try to reframe a lot of the conflicts today in those terms. They would say that Israel is part of the rim land. It should not exist. It should be pushed into the sea because it's surrounded by Muslim countries. So every now and then I see one of us share a map of the Middle East, and they show this great green sea of all these Muslim countries, and dot that is Israel. And they say Israel is not the problem. Well, that's true. They're not. They're just a tiny little blue dot. If they really were a problem, no, that's not the problem. But to the Russian mentality, it is, because that's Muslim land. It should be made out for the Muslims, not for the Jews. So,
Well, what about Cuba? How does Cuba or that area that they pointed to become important to them to dominate?
so that's a situation that's currently developing, and it's difficult to discern. We're seeing a lot of activity with Russian involvement in South America. I'm not quite as prepared to talk about that, other than the fact that they see that as
Well, they put that arrow there. I mean,
Yeah.
you didn't come up with that arrow. They
no,
did.
that's straight from the textbook that's being read in Russian universities. So that could have been. It's a little bit older of a work, so that could be a reference to like Cuban Missile Crisis
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
yeah.
We see that ideology coming out. So.
Go ahead.
So I know you were showing how kind of Russianism has this idea of breaking down boundaries and maybe expanding the way countries are defined, or maybe not necessarily countries.
Expanding is probably a better word than breaking down.
Okay.
Dissolving is more of a leftist ideology.
Okay.
So both are
Okay.
attack on the country, but yeah.
Do you think that plays a role in the progression towards a one world system split into 10 regions, or what? How do you think that plays into that idea?
Good question. I think that what we're seeing is a realization that globalism is not sustainable. It's not a good way to set up the world. So we're doing a sub-globalism instead, basically. Instead of having one world government, we're going to have a few world governments. Now, eschatologically speaking, the Antichrist is going to come, and he'll be powerful enough to unite the world into one government. Which in theory is easier to do if you only have a few poles rather than several countries. But the Bible says it's going to happen, so even if we have several countries instead, it's going to happen.
Thank you.
You mentioned the patriarch Krill
Yes.
said that those who die in the line of military duty, we believe that this sacrifice washes away all the sins that the person commits. Does Putin use this as a motivation, having lost over 1 million dead and casualties, or is this just like a personal apostate statement that he makes?
I haven't seen Putin interact with that particular statement.
Do the people, are they motivated by a guy like this?
Yes, but we have to understand that just because you're Russian Orthodox doesn't mean you're not also an atheist.
Yeah.
So whenever we have a cultural religion like Russian Orthodoxy, you're just baptized into it as a baby, it's not always taken that seriously. But there are a lot of people that do take it seriously. An interesting thing about soldiers is they're faced with morality, or their own mortality, and so they'll often turn to religion. In the case of Russia, it's often Islam. That's why we see a lot of guys from Dagestan coming in to rape the children of Ukraine, very much like their religious forefather Muhammad. But there are a lot of Russian Orthodox as well in the trenches, and in fact, one of the reasons for the split of Russian Orthodoxy that happened a few years ago is we're seeing Russian priests bless the weapons before they're being used to kill Ukrainian Orthodox. And now, in my opinion, I think that just gets the weapons a little bit wet with holy water. It's not actually holy water. But they do read a lot of meaning into that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.